Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing Connections podcast. I'm your host, Emmy Vadnais, and today we are talking about exploring healing racism in healthcare with Sheela Ivlev, who is an occupational therapist who specializes in wellness and mental health. She is committed to removing the barriers to care that keep people from accessing services for health and wellness. Welcome, Sheela. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Well, so this is a topic that for a lot of people is quite uncomfortable and can be a sensitive topic. And we, as we'll get into it, we'll know that actually some people have trauma around this topic. So if we could just get started a little bit, Sheela, if you could share, why is the topic of racism and healing it so important to you?
Sure. So I want to start by saying I don't consider myself a very political person. I don't know how to argue and win if somebody has a strong opinion that I disagree with. But a lot of what we've been seeing in the media the past few weeks, none of this is new information. This has been happening for decades, centuries, but it's being brought to our attention. It's at the forefront of the TV, news, social media right now. So for me, this is an issue of humanity. And this is where I feel like it is necessary for myself to step in as a human and especially as a healer. What do I have? What ethical obligations do I have? What power do I have in my position to do something about racism in healthcare and that affects people's health? I also wanted to add that, if anyone's curious about my background, I'm a first-generation American, so my parents are from India. And for me, that means that I really can't speak to everybody else's experience. I can't speak for any marginalized individuals or groups. My family doesn't have a history of generational oppression and racism. So I've been doing as much as I can to educate myself. To me, it's really important to be anti-racist as a human and again, as a healer. So for me, having these conversations, trying to get people involved and educate people, it's part of my process of my work in anti-racism.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. And Sheela, I'm so grateful for you because, with the horrific murder of George Floyd, I started putting out posts publicly on social media, and you were one of the few people who responded when I basically put a call out asking for people to share how we can heal racism. And I understand that there's also an issue with police and so forth. And for those of you who are listening, certainly, what happened to George Floyd is shouldn't have happened. And but it does bring up to the forefront all the different ways that people can be discriminated against and that there is a problem going on. And so I appreciate you being here today to help us understand, because I think that, there's so many different definitions to understand in this dialogue. And I think some people quite frankly shy away from it because maybe they don't feel like they're understanding all of them. And so I appreciate you taking the time today. If you could talk a little bit about what you feel racism is and how you know that it's happening or how you can see that it's happening in healthcare.
Sure. The classic definition of racism is prejudice or discrimination based on race. And what's really important to add to that is that this discrimination and prejudice comes from people in power. And this is where the topic gets controversial. This is where people maybe choose not to speak about it or have arguments about it. In America, the people in power are white people, right? That's how our system was built. And it hasn't changed significantly in centuries, unfortunately. White people still are in power. And so I think this is what causes a lot of the controversy, but it's important to recognize, if we're moving to healthcare, racism in healthcare, it's important to recognize that most healthcare providers are white. And so with racism, there's overt racism, Many of us have seen it personally. We've seen it in movies, we've seen it in TV, but the majority of us don't think that we are being racist. We don't think that we're actively racist. We don't think that we're contributing to racism. And that's where it's really important to recognize that there are biases that are based on race. And a lot of these biases, most of these biases are implicit, where you're not actually thinking about it, it's not intentional, it's at the subconscious level, and these biases are informed by stereotypes. Something really important to recognize is even if you don't believe in a stereotype, you're still influenced by that stereotype. So you can realistically be biased based on a stereotype that you've heard of, maybe grown up hearing, and now as an adult, you challenge that stereotype, but it's still embedded within you. Another important thing to recognize with racism, which I think a lot of people don't recognize that they're doing, are acts of microaggressions. So like everyday occurrences that seem completely harmless, most of the time they're not intended. And for people that are faced with racism, these microaggressions can be just as traumatic, especially if they're getting doses of it daily, multiple doses daily on a regular basis. It can be just as traumatic as overt racist acts. Mm-hmm. So do you want me to talk a little bit about like common microaggressions, if that's not like a familiar term?
I think that that's probably a new term. I mean, it's possible that it's a new term for people. Clearly, I don't know who's all listening, but again, there are a lot of different terms, and I think it's important. Yeah. So if you could share what microaggression is and how people might be engaging in it when they might not realize that they are.
Sure. So, you know, a common microaggression, again, that these things are typically happening without malice, without people recognizing that they're doing it, is maybe if you're walking down the street and there's a group of young Black teenagers that pass you by, maybe you're checking your wallet or clutching your purse a little bit tighter. I've been asked this question, I don't know how many times. People ask me where I'm from, and I was born and raised in San Francisco. So I say I'm from San Francisco, I'm from California, and I get that, no, where are you from? Where are you really from? You know, it seems harmless. They're really just curious, but you know, the connotation is I don't belong here. Another common one for me is I've been called a coconut or an Oreo, and this has come from white people. And again, it is given to me as a compliment. It means I'm brown on the outside, dark on the outside, white on the inside. And you know, I don't know how I'm supposed to react to that. And it, you know, again, people don't mean it in a negative way, but the connotation is, you know, maybe the brown is negative and the white part is the good part. You know, that's what I relate to. I see the white in you. Mm-hmm. So things like these unconscious biases, the implicit biases, and microaggressions, they are very commonplace in healthcare settings. So they definitely go both ways, right? There are plenty of healthcare providers that have stories of other healthcare providers, supervisors that are being biased, or you know, they're seeing daily microaggressions with sometimes patients as well. But with patients in the healthcare system, racism really does negatively affect their care, right? So, you know, in my article, there's a good number of statistics, and especially links to people of color receiving poor care when they are receiving care and having less access to care. But a really important one, especially for us healers to recognize, is that a person who has faced racism in healthcare is probably going to have a harder time trusting healthcare providers. So even that one negative experience could result in an individual really having doubts and maybe avoiding seeking care for really important health issues.
Could you share what your article is that you mentioned for those who would like to read it? It's a great article, and it's how we connected.
So I you know, give the information to my website, but I have a link to the article in my website, and it is really just about racism in healthcare, giving a little bit of background information, talking about racial trauma, which is not something that I ever learned in school, not something that anyone's ever talked about any of my workplaces. And I tried to give some practical steps as healthcare providers and healing providers. You don't have to have a license. You don't have to be a licensed healthcare professional to be healing, and to be able to take steps to be anti-racist, to check your bias, to help build trust, increase diversity within our professions.
Yeah. So can you speak a little bit about how you mentioned that predominantly in healthcare, it's predominantly lighter skinned people, white people who work in healthcare. Can you speak a little bit about how white people hold social or institutional power over people of color?
In the United States, 60% of our population identify as white. However, they make up 90% of the wealth within our nation. So, you see the power differences right there, right off the bat. When you think about doctors, CEOs, judges, politicians, police, and all of these statistics are available for people to see, what they identify as. The majority of these people are white. And again, it doesn't reflect that 60%. It's a much higher number. So we're seeing that the people that make decisions, the people that are in power, the people that are making up all the rules for everyone, they happen to be white.
Yeah, that really does paint a picture, literally, of understanding, and also it comes into economics and who can give money to what organizations to help people get in power and stay in power. Can you share a little bit about what racial trauma is?
Racial trauma is race-based stress, and it's unique to people of color. And so it's important with racial trauma to recognize that it can actually go back in time. So it can be intergenerational. So for people whose families and ancestors have histories of if they've been brutalized, if they've experienced significant racism, if they've been oppressed, then racial trauma actually, it can change your DNA structure. So racial trauma results in negative physical and emotional health consequences. It's ongoing, it's lifelong, it's intergenerational. And it's important to recognize with racial trauma that even witnessing other people of color experiencing racism, that can re-traumatize an individual. So, often when we think of trauma, there may have been one traumatic event and somebody is experiencing trauma possibly through their lifetime. With racial trauma, they're being re-traumatized. So, you mentioned George Floyd. So, we saw what happened to George Floyd. We watched him being murdered, and that is re-traumatizing people. And, that's a form of racial trauma. So it doesn't even have to be directed at you. But when you're seeing other people of color experiencing racial trauma, then you are being re-traumatized. And those things, like I mentioned, those implicit biases, those microaggressions, those can re-traumatize people as well, sometimes on smaller levels. But if it's happening constantly, then it can hit somebody at a bigger scale.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's probably true that a lot of people aren't aware that that's happening, especially if they're, not a person who identifies as a person of color or however they identify. I want to just talk a little bit more about some of these definitions, because there's so many definitions, and then let's get to what we can do, what people can do to help. And I think part of what we're doing is having a conversation, and you and I talked before this that we both feel it's very important to have conversations and to discuss this, because we recognize it is a complex issue, and that the more that people can have conversations and be educated, the better. So, and I certainly want to hear, your thoughts on that as well. But I'd also like to just bring up the term, there's a term called white privilege. And I was wondering if you could share, what is that term and how does that relate to racism?
So, white privilege, I think, can be a controversial topic. And, I've heard from a lot of white individuals who have who've experienced trauma, who've experienced poverty. And it's really important to recognize that white privilege is really just about your skin tone. So you may have had a difficult life, you may have had challenges and trauma, but your skin color isn't making it harder for you. So, with white privilege, we can connect racism and recognize that even if you are not trying to benefit from racism or from your white privilege, you are still benefiting from it. So, when we talk about the police for white individuals, it's pretty much a given that the police will be protecting you. The police are there to protect you. And for other individuals, because of their skin color, when they see the police, they might be traumatized. They might be afraid of being harassed. They may feel unsafe. White privilege is also when you think of discrepancies in salaries. So for every $1 a white person makes, a person of color makes 60 cents. I think we're both women. So if you want to simplify it and put it in terms of male privilege, we might think about instances. I've faced this plenty of times. There are discrepancies for sure in pay as well for men and women that have equal qualifications, equal degrees, equal experience. But I've faced patients where I've said the exact same thing, and a male with the same qualifications as me pretty much says what I said verbatim, and they're taking his word for it. Or I might be seen as a subordinate next to a male, right? So these privileges are things that you're not recognizing, you're not maybe even trying to take advantage of, but you're still benefiting, and it's solely based on skin tone.
Yeah, great answer to that question. I think that this is an area that I think a lot of white people have possibly the most, well, there's probably a lot of areas that are difficult for them, but I think that this term of white privilege, because it's something that I feel that a lot of people might be thinking, well, I'm not acting on perpetrating any racism on anybody, which of course there's implicit bias, which, we talked about, and good idea for people to take maybe some of those tests or to understand that within themselves. But I think that it can make white people feel guilty, have shame, feel blamed. They can have anger or frustration. They can maybe be in denial or defensive. And it can, I think, further perpetuate not wanting to be informed, and somehow maybe even feel that their morality is in question. And so if you could just share a little bit more about, well, then that leads to what's termed white fragility. I just read that book, which I really think is a great book to read, especially if you are a white person or identify as white. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the perfect segue into white fragility. And for me, I think about racial trauma in comparison to white fragility. And I know this is a term that does shut people down, but the reality is white people haven't faced race-based stress. And if I could take it back a little bit, when we talk about racism, I mentioned that there's power connected to that racism. So I'm not saying white people haven't faced bias, haven't faced prejudice or even discrimination, but it's not racism, because if it's, there's no power behind it, right? The person that is discriminating doesn't have the power over that other white person. So with white fragility, you want to think about there is no race-based stress involved. And so your threshold for tolerating maybe those conversations is lowered, right? So it might be hard to deal with. It might be, some people might get a little bit defensive, but if you haven't experienced and seen racism firsthand, then your threshold to tolerate it is lower. And so, if you think of white fragility in that sense, it's basically just describing it. Racism is a really, really like gross, brutal, violent, people die because of racism, right? People are killed because of racism. People's health is ignored because of racism. And so it is a very sensitive, emotional, powerful topic. And if it's not something that you've had to deal and face, then you don't have a threshold for it. So it is harder to take.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What would you say to somebody who's a lighter skinned person who identifies as white, that they've had racism perpetrated on them from somebody who's a person of color?
I would say, going back to that definition of racism, that includes power. I want to hear your story. It sounds like you have been discriminated against. That person did have prejudice and malice, possibly depending on the situation. But again, this is where it gets controversial. Racism doesn't go both ways. There's no reverse racism, because that person of color doesn't hold systemic and institutional power over the white individual. So it definitely is discrimination, and definitely can be horrible, but it's not this issue that has been within our systems for centuries.
Yeah, well said. So just a couple more terms here, and then we can get to the healing part. Again, the conversation is healing as well, I believe, to help educate people. Can you share a little bit about what white savior or virtue signaling is?
So these terms are really, you hear them a lot commonly now, because of social media, right? There's a lot of activism over social media. And I will say that, white saviorism and virtue signaling really is based about your own benefit. What are you getting out of your perceived activism, whether it's like a social media post or what you're doing? And, the comments that people may be getting on their social media feeds are, in my opinion, based on like hurt and harm. People, their wounds are open, and they're not sure if you're taking action because it looks good on social media, because it makes you look good, or if you're really in it. A month or two from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, are you still going to be taking action, or did you just post something on social media because it makes you look good and all your friends are doing it? So there is a history of white saviorism, and in India there's plenty of that, right? People going to these different countries, adopting kids, helping kids, saving kids, and the hungry, the needy. Are you doing it because you really care and you want to make a difference, or are you doing it because it makes you look good? Really, it's about that. And I have a personal opinion on this. I think conversations and education is huge. If you are a white person with a predominantly white following, it's really important to educate people. There are definitely people that are gonna shoot you negative messages, comments, DMs, whatever it is, because they're hurting. They have faced a lifetime and even generations of hurt and harm, and they don't know if you're stepping up now because you actually care, or if you're stepping up now because it looks good for you.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, because I think that people who are white, myself included, I want to do something good. Somebody could accuse me of virtue signaling by what we're doing here today. That's fine. If somebody wants to accuse me of that, I don't think that's the spirit of what I'm doing here. I'm really truly trying to help society. We're healthcare people, healing. I've been educated about, how the systemic racism has been around, sadly, for long, long time. And I recognize that I do have a platform. I do have people who follow me on social media. I do have a large email list where I can help share this information so that people can become educated and begin to, make these changes in positive directions. So So another term that's really gotten quite popular is anti-racism. Can you share what that is?
So anti-racism is really just about undoing the harm and hurt from racism. Um, this topic, racism and anti-racism, can be really polarizing for some people. It's being super politicized. The media is taking it to different extremes. But to me personally, anti-racism is lifelong action, advocacy, education. And to me, I can hear statistics, read statistics, and form one opinion, and those same statistics can be skewed to help me form another opinion. And to me, if I'm aware that an individual is hurt, an individual is being harmed, and there are plenty of stories out there of people who have been hurt by racism, to me, it's important, especially as a healer and as a human, to do work to undo centuries of hurt, centuries of harm. And for me, I feel like I have some control within the healthcare system, but it's everywhere, right? Racism is in education, it's in our political system, it's in our judicial system, it's everywhere. So anti-racism to me is really just taking some action, again, educating yourself, doing something to undo those centuries of hurt and harm.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any comments for any public figures who might say that anti-racism is actually not a good thing?
I mean, like I said, I don't have powerful statements to argue with people that have public platforms and a following, but as a human, how are you not compelled when you hear an individual's story of how their lives were torn apart or how their family members were taken from them because of their race? To me, that's far more important than statistics that can negate one person's story. If you can prevent one person from being harmed or their life taken because of racism, then wouldn't you get up and do something about it? Why would you argue against it?
Great. And how can we inspire people to do what it is you would like us to do? Particularly when it is such a sensitive topic, it does make people uncomfortable, can make people uncomfortable. Some people are more comfortable discussing this than others. And some people just might want to shy away from it or pretend it doesn't exist.
I think that we're in a pivotal moment in society where you have to decide what side you're going to be on. Do you want to take no action, sit quietly, and perpetuate racism? Because realistically, if you aren't standing up and doing anything, especially if you're in a position of power, if you're a white person, if you have wealth, if you have any influence, you can actually do something about it. Or do you want to be on the side where you are taking action and actively trying to dismantle racism in every facet of society?
Yeah.
So it's really just asking yourself that question, where do I stand?
Mm-hmm. And what would you like to see happen in healthcare to help heal racism?
I think it's important for providers to recognize racial trauma and really the power of it. If you're willing, take the time to read what I've written about racial trauma. There are links to articles that actually break down what's happening physiologically and within your DNA when you're faced with racial trauma, but just recognizing that that is real. So that you can be more sensitive when you're working with people of color. I think it's important, again, in taking the side of undoing injustices, really checking your bias. I think of us healing professionals. What are we doing to help others heal? So, if I can ask you, Emmy, if you're working with an individual who's experienced trauma, what are some things that you're doing to help heal that trauma?
Well, that's a really good question. Yes, I'm an occupational therapist like yourself, and definitely address mind, body, spirit healing. Have training a lot of different various techniques. So I'll mention a couple here. There's many things that I've done when I work with people with trauma. But essentially it's validating their experiences, helping them with their emotions, going back to whatever events that had occurred and working with the energy in the body, the subsequent thoughts, the beliefs, the new beliefs that have been formed about themselves, about others, right? Others, groups, maybe whomever has they've encountered in that experience, and then work with them through various techniques. I found that a form of interactive mindfulness, being able to have a person work with all of their thoughts, their beliefs, their emotions, their body sensations, connected to whatever their intention is around healing that trauma, can be very beneficial. And also helping with another technique called emotional freedom technique, which is one of the main techniques the VA uses for working with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and as well. And then I'm also a big fan of helping people connect with their own inner wisdom and intuition. I'm just finishing up writing an intuitive development book. It's a topic near and dear to me. And I think that the more that people can connect with their own inner knowing and inner wisdom on what helps them, I'm a big fan of helping with that stress reduction and helping with being able to process the stress that's been, in the tissues, in the psyche, in the consciousness, but also being able to find new ways of reframing that experience that comes from their own inner psyche, their own inner knowing, so that they can evolve that. So, and I know you're also a therapist as well. I'd love to hear what you do as well when you work with your folks.
Well, I thank you for sharing in such great detail, all of the powerful tools that you utilize in healing. And I wanted to stress that with, healing racial trauma, when you think about healing in healthcare, everything you're doing is valuable. And even if it's race-based stress, we still need to take care of ourselves the way any human would need to take care of ourselves. So, in my practice, I'm really focused on self-care and wellness. So making sure you're getting enough sleep, making sure you're eating meals and you're trying to eat nutritious meals, and building in self-care, building in acts of joy on a daily basis, engaging in those activities that are meaningful and enjoyable for you, learning relaxation techniques, setting boundaries, right? Learning to say no, taking space from people that are making you uncomfortable, making you not feel good about yourself. And so with racial trauma, we do have to keep in mind that this trauma is unfortunately lifelong and persistent, right? Until we can end racism, racial trauma is gonna continue. So as healers, not only are we working to heal our clients and our patients, but we also have to actively dismantle racism. Otherwise, that trauma cycle is going to persist. It's going to continue. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really, really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I just want to add too that I think for all those who are listening, hearing us, thank you for listening and listening this long, that I think it's important for you also to listen to what comes up in your mind, your emotions, your psyche around these topics, and seek out whatever support you might need, because I think that, we're all evolving as spirits. These are my personal beliefs and what I've witnessed a lot with working with lots of people over the years. And that we do need to take care of ourselves, but also recognize we are part of society and a culture, and that, we all impact each other, whether we think we do or not. How we treat others in various ways will also come back to ourselves. I do want to ask you too, Sheela, is there anything that you would like to see happen? I think a lot of times when there's complex issues like this, it's easy for people to think, oh, somebody else can deal with that. So I love how you bring this home to us individually. Is there also something that you would like to see those who are in positions of power? Now, we are in a position of power doing this podcast, but as far as people who maybe are, on various healthcare boards, what you would like to see them do?
Sure. I think diversity in every profession is very, very important. You know, going back to healing and trauma, trust is huge. For people that might not be able to relate to racial trauma, if you think about if anyone has experienced sexual trauma, you may not feel comfortable working with a male therapist or a male provider, and you might trust a female. And you don't know this individual yet, it's just your comfort level. And so for individuals who've faced racism and discrimination from their healthcare providers or have experienced racial trauma outside of healthcare, for them, it may be beneficial, it may build trust. They might feel better about seeing a provider that they can relate to. And we don't have that choice in different parts of the country and within different professions. They may not exist, or they may not be available in your area to work with you. And so, if we can do more to encourage and get more minorities out there in these different professions, then we will be building trust. We will be able to get to a higher level of cultural competency. And I struggle with that word because no one can master any culture. It's a lifelong process. It's cultural humility, like you mentioned, kind of recognizing where we're at, where things come from within us, why we have certain beliefs, while we're actively trying to learn more and be open to other cultures and backgrounds. So, getting more people that look different, that are from different backgrounds, are only going to open our minds up more and build trust within healthcare communities between providers and patients.
And what would you say to, let's say, somebody who's in a position of power of accepting, who gets accepted into occupational therapy, physical therapy, nursing, medical school, and they might say, well, but there weren't that many people of color who applied?
I mean, all of these, unfortunately, these are lifelong questions that we don't have the answers to, right? If we had solutions to racism, then we wouldn't be having this talk right now. And you have to go way back, right? So where are you recruiting? How many people are even aware of OT, right? Do kids know about OT in schools and want to be OTs when they grow up? Probably not, unless one of their parents was an OT or they worked with an OT. So, we really have to advocate for our profession. We have to make people aware of what we're doing. We really need to go out there in the community and let people know about our services and motivate people from all backgrounds to be interested in our profession, and let them know that they stand a chance to get into these professions, and that there's good pay and they could be doing great things, and why it's valuable for them to take some time and explore what we're doing and think about, being an OT when you grow up.
Yeah.
So just going way back.
Yeah. And what would you like to share about empathy and
Yes.
compassion?
Thank you. So I forgot to bring that up. I think this is important in healing. This is important in healthcare. This is important for individuals. A lot of what we talked about had to do with maybe people disagreeing or kind of feeling like it's not their problem. And what I didn't mention is, for a lot of people, they are empathizing with the pain, whether they're white or a person of color, they're empathizing with the pain that other people are experiencing, especially right now, people of color, Black people in particular. And empathy can really be draining and can really kind of stall out any activism. Empathy is wonderful, right? As humans, we have the capacity to feel strongly and really take on what another person is experiencing. And when that something is pain, when that emotion is pain, then it's draining. And if you can step into compassion, then you're able to take compassionate action. You're recognizing that emotion, you recognize what the person is experiencing, but you're not just sitting in that emotion and letting it just drain both of you and take all the energy out of you. You are actually recognizing that you need to take action so you can get rid of that distress, get rid of that pain, get rid of that suffering. And so I think it's an important time for every single one of us to recognize we have to step out of that empathy drain and move into compassion, where we're taking compassionate action to solve problems, actively solve problems, and we're not ignoring the pain. We're actually doing something about it.
Yeah. So as healthcare practitioners, certainly you and I can relate to a term called compassion fatigue. And that some wise teacher told me many years ago of, being able to be present with the person, but then also be able to step back so that can take care of yourself. I mean, all of this, we're all connected. It all affects all of us all the time, but so that we're not, like you said, just sitting in it and ruminating or getting stressed and fatigued ourselves, and then we become powerless in the action steps we want to take. So being able to have that self-care and being able to know what you are able to do. And I think that, for those of you who are listening, if you are inspired to understand a little bit more of these terms, Google them. If you're interested in reading, maybe having checking out some books that are on your mind so you can become more educated, and to have conversations with people. Is there any tips or suggestions you would suggest, Sheela, for somebody as far as when we talk about having conversations and how we both feel that's so important, and how people can do that?
So there are, for especially anti-racism education, there are so many resources out there. And, I'm happy to link some up. I do want to just go back to the talk of compassion and self-care. And it's so important. It doesn't matter who you are and what you look like. You have to take care of yourself first, right? You have to invest in self-care. Us healers, we have to listen to ourselves, right? We have to practice what we preach, because you're no good to anybody if you're broken, if you're drained, if you're not taking care of yourself. So, for anybody listening, start with yourself, right? Take care of yourself, make sure you're whole, make sure you're strong, make sure you're feeling well, because you can't take action. You can't be an activist if you're not well. So really just starting there. And, I share plenty of self-care resources on my social media and my website. But it's important, if you need more than just what you have control over, seeking professional help, right? Somebody to talk to, somebody to help you implement those self-care routines. But as far as like being able to take action, being able to really educate yourself, like you said, there are tons of resources where you can do some reading and learning yourself, because if you have friends, or even if you're reaching out to strangers to maybe learn more about their experiences in racism, if you're feeling drained from everything that you've read and you've seen on social media, imagine somebody who is being re-traumatized on a daily basis because of their skin color. They are beyond drained, and they might not be ready to have these conversations right now, or maybe even ever, right? So, it's up to us. I'm not a white person, but I'm still taking the time to do readings that are literally, the titles are, education for white people, what white people can do for anti-racism. Because for me, it's a lifelong practice. It's really important. I want to be involved. And, there are so many that I can just basically give resources. There's movies, there's books, there are videos, articles, there's plenty out there. Like you said, you can Google anything, and it's available.
And we'll put a link to your website, and people can find out more information there as well. I think too, it's important that when we have these conversations, that we're all learning, and we're gonna make what some people might perceive as mistakes when we're having conversations with people, but we need to be compassionate to others as well, on all sides, all of us to each other, so that if somebody says something that seems somewhat offensive, hopefully that person, if you can talk with them about it, this is really, they'll be receptive to that, and then you can be caring to one another to help each other learn and grow. I mean, this is really where nonviolent communication grew out of, was from the racial injustices and from the 60s and so forth. So yeah, well, is there anything else you would like to share today, Sheela, around how we can heal racism in healthcare?
I just wanted to add to what you just said about, it is really important to keep in mind if you're really trying, if you're trying to be an ally, if you're trying to educate yourself, you're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. Like I said, I'm no expert, and I can tell you no one is an expert because no one has solved the problem of racism. Okay. So we're all going to make mistakes. We're maybe going to say something, or, again, this is like the social media world right now. So most of us are utilizing social media for activism. So you might say or do something wrong. Just listen to the feedback that you get. And remember, people are hurting, right? People have centuries of hurt that they're holding on to right now. So you might not be able to address everyone, but if you know in your heart that you're trying to do the right thing, don't let a negative comment stop you, right? You know what your intentions are. So we need absolutely every single person to step up right now, to speak up, to speak out, to hold others accountable, and to take action. So, do what you're capable of doing while you're still taking care of yourself.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Sheila. How can people get in touch with you, or how can they find more of the wonderful information you've talked about here today?
So I would suggest hopping on my website. It's otbayarea.com. And there I have links to my social media. I have most of my resources linked up there, including the article that I wrote about racism in healthcare and what we can do about it.
Awesome. Well, Sheila, thank you so much for having this conversation that's often uncomfortable for people and can be sensitive. And I really appreciate you taking the time to help educate all of us and to be with us and to help explore ways that we can help heal racism in healthcare.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining everyone on the Healing Connections podcast. Be well. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.